There's a great historiographical debate about whether there was an Anglo-Saxon state, indeed an Anglo-Saxon nation state. The English had a huge swathe of territory in France, which was theirs.
What actually constitutes a good ruler in this period?
They can see the big strategic picture, but they're also emotionally intelligent.
How would you describe the influence of Christianity on the creation of the English state?
The papacy acts as a kind of medieval United Nations.
The expulsion of the Jewish community, it's absolutely terrible. He saw that if crime was out of control, it damaged his authority, it damaged royal authority, it damaged government.
The title of the book specifically mentions the making of the English state itself. What happens during this time period that creates the English state, as opposed to the English nation that had been created a few centuries or years before this time?
I think the really important thing for us to say is that England was centralised and had developing government incredibly early in its history. There's a great historiographical debate about whether there was an Anglo-Saxon state, indeed an Anglo-Saxon nation state. And when the Norman conquest came along in 1066, a lot of the quite developed governmental apparatus of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom was absorbed by the Normans. And the Normans, of course, added additional dimensions of organisation of their own, castle building, new dimensions of law, feudal structure. But in many ways, the key developmental period, to my mind, is with the Angevins and starts with Henry II. And a major driver, so this is before the book's coverage, because the book starts with the reign of King John in 1199.
Of course.
But the driver for this is the huge pressure that the kings of England were under, Henry II, Richard the Lionheart, and John, in respect of their French lands. And it's really important that we recognise here that the English kings were not in the business of imperialism in France. The English kings came from France. They came from France with the conquest, and then with the acquisition of the great Angevin lands with the accession of Henry II, the English had a huge swathe of territory in France, which was theirs. It's not something that they were trying to take from the French. They were there first. It was theirs. The French were in the business of trying to take it from them, under Philip Augustus in particular, and then under his successors. And a major driver for what happened in the period that the book covers is that pressure of really, really fundamental and difficult and expensive foreign war in defence of the English king's lands. So that's the first driver. The second driver came from Henry II as well. One of the things that Henry II did as part of taking control of the kingdom after the anarchy of Stephen and Matilda was creating the common law, as we call it, a single legal system covering the entire country, all free men and women, which was almost everyone in the country, and accessible by everyone, including ordinary people. And one of the extraordinary characteristics of the common law, once it's fully operational in the late 13th and 14th centuries, is that something like 95% of the cases were brought by peasants. It was a law system for everyone. It was highly accessible. And these two drivers, the development of the common law and huge pressure of foreign policy, which created need for taxation and the like, really were the things that produced the change. And the change in many ways was encapsulated by Magna Carta in 1215, which was driven both by the existence of the common law and by the pressures created by Angevin government through the huge foreign policy needs, and also, and Caroline will say a bit about this in a few moments, by the particular ways in which King John ruled. And from Magna Carta, which placed the king below the law for the first time, we then have a series of developments that were a consequence of Magna Carta that are really important for the world in which we live today. National taxation, because wars had to be paid for by consent under Magna Carta. From national taxation, you had to have a consenting body. That produced Parliament. And once you've got national taxation and Parliament and the continued growth of the common law, over a period of time through further political crises, great discussion, the influence of political thought across Europe in certain ways, you get, by the late 13th century and into the 14th century, the kind of co-option of government interests by the whole community of the realm, by the political community. So you go from, in 1199, government which was fundamentally the king's and foreign policy which was fundamentally the king's, to by 1399, government and foreign policy which belonged to everyone. A really fundamental shift. But if we think about our standpoint today, the common law, a legal system accessible to all, applicable to all, under which the monarch sits through Magna Carta, national taxation, parliament, and that sense of the collective ownership of government. These are the really, really big changes. Now, of course, there are other periods of history that were also incredibly important to the world in which we live today in the UK. The Industrial Revolution is the one that immediately springs to my mind as absolutely fundamental. But if we're thinking about the constitutional bedrock, this period is it.
I guess a good place to sort of feed off then from that point is, because we're covering a period of 200 years here, I think it might be good just for the listeners to try and encapsulate what's going on in this period and give like a high level overview. So if you could briefly give me a synopsis of the six kings that we're kind of looking at in this time period from 1199 to 1399 as the frame. And just give like a little bit of a flavor of their character perhaps, and what they kind of necessarily brought to the role and perhaps some of their big impacts.
If we start with John, John is actually a really interesting character. It's easy to caricature him because, you know, lots of the kind of the stories about John and how evil he was and the nasty things he did, lots of those are actually true. So it's easy to caricature him as just a straightforward villain. It's a bit more complicated than that. So he's the youngest son of Henry II. And John was known as Lackland. He wasn't expected to be king. He wasn't, I mean, they struggled even to carve out any sort of landed inheritance for him. So by fortune, his brothers, all died. And there's John suddenly becoming king in 1199. He tried earlier as well. He tried to unseat his brother, Richard. I suppose the thing to understand about the backdrop to John, and I don't want to kind of get into too much psychological analysis, but I think this is very relevant, and people will kind of understand the point that I'm making here. The family was immensely dysfunctional. So no matter how able Henry II was as a king, and he was incredibly able, his marriage to Eleanor was clearly very dysfunctional, very odd. I mean, it's an odd situation in which your wife rebels against you with some of your own children when you're the king. It's an odd situation when your kids are rebelling against you. So, this is not a happy family. And within that, John is at he's kind of lowest in the pecking order. As I say, he's not expected to have anything. Even when Henry II tries to carve something out for him, it's to come out of what one of his brothers has, and they really don't like it. So there's no sense in which, my brother should have something. They don't think in those terms. And you might say, well, I'm being a bit anachronistic to imagine that they would, but human beings are human beings. And even in the medieval period, people are not just kind of out for themselves all the time. We see plenty of instances of people looking out for other people. This is not that family. So John is brought up in the most brutal of environments, in which getting and hanging on to power is something that you do essentially by force, because somebody will be trying to take it off you. And it's kind of normalized. So coming to the throne in 1199, it's either him or his nephew Arthur. And from John's perspective, it's obviously got to be him. So we get rid of Arthur, and that's the world in which he emerges from, and the person that world has both created, and obviously the genetics of it, and the innate personality traits. That means he's paranoid because he always thinks somebody's going to be trying to unseat him. You add to that the fact that he is also somebody who makes enemies easily. And it's a bit weird with John, because he'll make lots and lots of progress and then he'll just throw it away. And he does that multiple times throughout the reign with particular people. At the same time, he's incredibly able administratively. He's incredibly active. He's not lazy. Complex character, capable of alienating lots of people, highly paranoid, but most of all, kind of in a set of circumstances that are drifting beyond his control. And you might say this was kind of building up from the Angevins. They had this big empire that they kind of almost come together by chance. It was never going to be something they could hold on to forever. And John was up against an incredibly able French king who, wanted to get stuff off the English kings as landholders in France. That requires lots and lots of money because he's got to defend this territory. And that puts a lot of pressure on people in his country, in England in particular, because England is rich. And so it's treated as something as a milch cow. When John loses Normandy in 1204, he loses a vast source of revenue because Normandy itself is quite rich. So that puts more and more pressure on England. So you've got a funny combination here of a villainous character and then circumstances. Henry III, like his father, in the sense that he has the kind of what we might call the Angevin temper. He can kind of fly off the handle, but quite different from his father in lots and lots of ways. Much more easily cowed than his father, much less administratively able, much less able to kind of see his way through a situation strategically. That John at least can do some of that. He just can't make it happen. So when Henry the Third comes to the throne, he's a small child. There's a civil war ongoing after Magna Carta, which we'll talk about in due course. That's kind of dealt with for him because he's too young to be dealing with that when he comes to the throne. But when he comes of age, you see this person who can't make the right judgments, can't prioritize in the right way, alienates people mostly because he's incompetent rather than ill-willed. And then we have more and more political disorder, lots of which comes from the kind of same origins as Magna Carta. So I won't get into all of the detail of that right now. Henry, unlike John, is actually, in lots of ways, an extremely nice guy. He's very likable. He's got a great sense of humor. His kids absolutely love him. And you can't say the same about John. I mean, he was not a lovable person in any shape or form. Henry clearly was. And when he died, Edward, who became Edward the First, his son, obviously, was really very, very, very upset. There was clearly a very strong familial bond there. Edward the First has that Angevin temper as well, has the administrative ability, like his grandfather, is very full of kind of energy. He's not lazy, and really gets the big picture. And the problems that emerge in Edward I's reign, at least in England, are about the way in which he realizes there are certain concessions he needs to make, but in other ways regards the king's prerogative as extending much further, I think, than his subjects think it should by that point. And there's a kind of fundamental mismatch there. And Edward digs in and is duplicitous at points about getting his way. So quite different personalities, but with certain traits that run through that we often refer to as kind of Angevin trait amongst them. I think Richard will pick up the thread there.
Yeah, so Edward II, chip off the old block in terms of height and strength and at times willfulness, but otherwise absolutely not his father's son. Lazy, self-focused, irresponsible, duplicitous, shallow and unconvincing, and later in life, actually early in life too, cruel. So a really, really problematic individual, very, very difficult for the realm, for the state to function if the king, who's effectively head of state plus prime minister plus foreign secretary plus chief military commander all rolled together, is himself completely dysfunctional. And Edward II, fundamentally irresponsible, dysfunctional. So huge problems in his reign and thereafter. Edward III, so really interesting. So son of the father in no discernible way. And when we talk about the psychological background that produces problematic kingship, you look at Edward III's childhood, where he's got this dreadful father who in the end was murdered by his mother who was having an affair with a member of the nobility. It's hard to imagine a more dysfunctional childhood. And yet, by age 17, actually by age 15, so far as I can tell, Edward III's completely normal. So you've got somebody who is straightforward, clear thinking, decisive, brave, highly intelligent, emotionally intelligent, can be demanding, can be obsessive, um, doesn't always manage to carry everybody with him. And there are some political crises because of that, but overall, an incredibly capable person. And then his grandson, Richard II, to finish, the sixth of our kings. And again, Richard's childhood is often talked about. What was it about his education that produced this really problematic individual? In my view, maybe slightly anticipating something I think you might ask us a little later, Max, is that this is just, it's the accident of fate. It's the accident of history. Richard was narcissistic, paranoid, not very bright, idle, lazy, self-obsessed, uh, again, duplicitous, cruel, hopeless. So like a kind of a slightly more intellectually ambitious version of Edward II. Actually, maybe slightly less intelligent than Edward II. Edward II was capable of writing a very funny letter and making a good speech. Richard II, a really, really problematic individual.
Just on that point, actually, because I think you've both brought it up in one way or another, just before we start getting into, I guess, going through the kings individually, I think it's quite be interesting to understand to some degree what actually constitutes a good ruler in this period. I mean, I was recently watching an interview Dan Snow did with David Mitchell on there for David's book Unruly, and he was kind of making the point to some degree that you do need to be somewhat horrible to be a good king. I mean, Caroline, you kind of mentioned this earlier in regards to, John's treatment of Arthur. It can be seen as very cruel. But on the other hand, this was kind of to some degree how the politics of kingship worked to some degree in this period. And so I guess from my perspective, what the best you can kind of really hope for, I guess, is a sense of stability and even-handedness. I guess are the two things I would think about. But I'd like to get, both of your thoughts. Maybe Caroline, you can start off with on this. What really constitutes being a good ruler in this period?
It's an interesting question. And just to sort of come back to some of the things you were talking about there, um, if you think about any walk of life where there's hierarchy, which, and that there's so many different areas where there can be hierarchy. If you're in a working environment, if you're in a governmental environment, the sorts of people who are the best leaders are people who have both intellectual intelligence, they can see the big strategic picture, they can also make strong tactical, logistical, operational decisions. Um, but they're also emotionally intelligent. Um, and I think that's where I would slightly differ with some of what you said there. I think you can be a decent person and be a king. I think fundamentally, people are not looking to get rid of the king. That's not the starting point. It's a bit like when we get a new government in the UK, and we do seem to get one about every 6 months, as far as I can see at the moment. And that's a whole interesting question about the levels of instability that we're seeing in the UK that we never saw in kind of the decades preceding. We aren't automatically wanting that government to fail. In fact, it's a standard thing that a new government gets an immediate boost. People are very enthusiastic. They want it to work. They're optimistic. And then the government has to deliver on that. So in this period, it's not only that, the king is appointed by God as well. So he's not just elected. He's not elected at all. He's chosen by God. People aren't looking at him and saying, let's try and get the throne, let's try and get rid of him. So there is an immense amount of authority that just sits with the king. What people struggle with, and it's the same thing you struggle with in a work environment, or as I say, any hierarchical environment in particular, because of the power dynamics, is when somebody is fickle, when for no good reason they will start to abuse somebody, where their decision making is unpredictable, where their personality is volatile. Those are the things that cause the problems, alongside somebody being incompetent, alongside somebody perhaps being lazy. Those are the sorts of things that are problematic. So for a king, it's a more difficult job, it's a more complicated job. And in the medieval period, of course, it involves potentially killing people, because you are a trained soldier. You are going to go into battle in all likelihood, in a way that, Keir Starmer is never going to have to do. So it's more complex. You have to manage different facets from what leaders now have to manage most of the time. But the fundamentals are exactly the same for any kind of walk of life and any power dynamic. So those are the sorts of things I would say in response to that. I don't know whether Richard would add something there.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with that, but maybe just take it a touch further. I mean, what you said about, um, uh, I think you said David Mitchell and Dan Snow, Max. The king needed to be cruel. If you look at kings who were deposed and what people said about the deposition, why they were deposed, they deposed them because they were cruel. Being cruel was the wrong thing to be. I mean, if we look at Edward III, who was widely regarded in the Middle Ages and the early modern period as the absolute paragon of kingship, so beyond Henry V, the main man. And what people said about Edward III in his lifetime and shortly afterwards was things like this. With his people, he was as mild as a lamb. With his enemies, with England's enemies, he was as ferocious as a leopard. It's that combination of justice, rationality, as Caroline said, predictability, trustworthiness, and toughness with enemies. But we're not talking about internal enemies most of the time. We're talking about external enemies. So if you are looking for a kind of modern parallel, it might be a kind of cross between Tony Blair and Mrs. Thatcher. To use Tony Blair's phrase, tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. It's that balance of pliability, good sense, sympathy, and toughness, plus the predictability that Caroline talked about, and the being bright, emotionally intelligent, competent, hardworking. So the kings who were really, really good, the kings who were really, really bad, Edward II was in bed until 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Edward III was up at the crack of dawn at his desk.
No, right, certainly. Certainly, I think one individual that certainly had, to your point, both internal and external enemies was John. And I think to what Caroline you were saying earlier, is he was certainly generalized as a very villainous archetype in terms of English monarchy history. Was there anything that surprised you about him whilst doing all the work to create the book? I think what I maybe picked up to some degree is that I think, again, to sort of in the zeitgeist, he's kind of recognized as just kind of this cruel, arrogant, narcissistic king. But what I picked up in some degree is that he does have moments of being like sort of fairly competent. To your point, he does seem quite active. He does move around the kingdom to try and make sure his authority is assertive. He does have some effect of it. He does lose obviously a lot of lands in France, but he's able to come with some of the Treaty of La Goulet, for example. He does seem to have some aspects to him that at least make him somewhat competent. Now, perhaps his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, mitigates a lot of his potential disasters for him, because she in herself seems to be kind of a little bit of an unsung hero in this kind of period itself. But are there any aspects about him that kind of surprised you when you were sort of doing the research for this component?
To be honest, no. Mainly because I've been teaching John for kind of nearly 20 years by the time I was doing the research for this book. So if I go back 20 years, I suppose the thing that's always kind of got me with John, but it's the same when you're judging people generally. Somebody can have immense clarity of vision and really seem to get it, and then the next day they don't get it. And I think to myself, did they ever get it, or were they just accidentally seeming to be competent on that day? What happens between those two moments? Because John does have them. Um, I guess, I mean, with John, to some extent, there's a not being able to help himself in terms of how he sees other people. No one is to be trusted. And if that's how you approach other people, then you are going to be hypersensitive to anything that you think is them potentially, doing something behind your back in order essentially to kill you, remove you from the throne and kill you. I just want to come back to something we were talking about earlier with kings and what makes them good kings as well. Because I think one thing we didn't touch on, and I think it's a really interesting question generally in history, is charisma and what we mean by charisma when we talk about leaders. Because we often think about it's kind of one of the things that I've thought a lot about in our recent political history for probably obvious reasons, that there are people that you may or may not agree with, but they have some kind of magnetism. Um, and that magnetism, in some cases, is what makes them immensely dangerous. In some cases, is what makes them immensely efficient. And one of the things that I felt came through to me very, very clearly when writing this book was that, I was in this generation where there was a kind of backlash against what we used to call great men history, not least because it's great men, and kind of women were largely written out of the picture. But if you put that bit on one side, um, the idea, that individuals don't kind of dominate history, don't kind of change the course of history, that it's much more complicated than that. When I was writing this book, and increasingly as I was teaching students over the years, I ended up concluding that an awful lot of the time it is the individual. And that does bring us back to this matter of charisma. So yeah, there are long term things going on that make John's job extremely difficult, extremely challenging. In the same way as you can say, when Theresa May became prime minister, when Keir Starmer became prime minister, they were faced with an unenviable set of circumstances. But then there's how you handle difficult circumstances, and who you take with you on that journey. And of course, John not only doesn't take people with him, he alienates people. But what do we mean when we talk about people taking people with you and this charisma point? I wonder if we could kind of um, explore that as a thread, I guess, throughout what we've been saying, because I think Richard was talking about Edward III, who definitely did have that. It's a kind of almost undefinable element in somebody's personality that goes beyond all of the competence, whether that be emotional intelligence or intellectual intelligence that we talked about. Just thought I'd throw that in because I think it's such an interesting question.
Yeah, I guess in terms of charisma, I suppose to some degree it is your ability in some regard to have relationships with people, but also how you project your sense of self. And I suppose in an era where it's not like today with modern social media where you can access a lot of the population very easily through online media. Um, in that kind of age, in this age in particular, without the benefits of the printing press, your ability to project a sense of self, and a sense of values and a sense of how you comport yourself, I guess is very important because there aren't that many other means for you to be able to project like a branding, an image, a rhetoric, a propaganda in many ways. Um, Now, what that charisma comes down to, I'm not too sure. I mean, Richard, I'd like to perhaps get your thoughts on it, but to some degree, I guess it's to some degree intelligence, your ability to be empathetic and empathize with people and understand what they would like to see in you as a leader. I guess it's some sort of EQ management, being able to sort of manage relationships. I imagine it's a lot of things, and maybe also just to some degree a temperament, and a degree of assertiveness without being seen as arrogant. A way to be seen as compassionate without being seen as weak. I would see in many ways. So I guess in some regards, it's some of just that. It could just come down to some degree temperament.
I think there's one thing to add too, which is that they have a massive advantage. And Caroline talked about this earlier in a way, simply by being the king. So if we're thinking about what makes them charismatic, one of the things that they have is this completely magical quality, which actually, even in our own lives, we understand, because we had that sense about Queen Elizabeth II. It wasn't just about who she was as a person, it was about the fact that she was the Queen. And particularly when she'd been on the throne for a very long time. And even with King Charles, where I don't think there is that same sense of universal admiration for the character that we certainly used to, I think, experience towards the tail end of the reign of Elizabeth II, at least. Um, but even with King Charles, there's still that sense of um, the magical about being in contact with the king. And of course, medieval kings were highly mobile and highly visible a lot of the time. If you look at their itineraries, they moved around the country almost constantly. And of course, if you think about the great military commanders, um, there would have been a lot of people who would have gone back home having fought in their armies literally alongside them, who had have been there, who would have been there when Edward the Third personally talked to the troops on the eve of the Battle of Crecy, when he shared the same food and drink that they drank, when he slept in the same rough circumstances. And that would have been communicated back through social networks, through the family and through connection. So there would have been quite a wide sense of what the king was like, actually, perhaps much wider than we might think.
Certainly. And as it pertains, I guess to John, I mean, certainly the big thing, I think, at least from my interpretation of the book, that comes out of his reign that does form, that it really, well, it contributes to the forming of the English state is Magna Carta. And to a great degree, you can say that that's not just a pivotal moment in the founding of the English state, but quite frankly, a lot of Western states or just states across the globe as well. This concept that that the king is not above rule of law and does have a duty to its citizens to some regard. Was the scale of John's cruelty actually, to some degree, the cause of the principles behind the Magna Carta, because it caused such a um, reverberation that sort of had to be mediated to some degree?
It's complicated. So the individual cruelty, the way in which he treated people in and of itself, no. What it meant for their position and for their experience of kingship, yes. So with the common law, what happened, and with largely, and this is something that's really important to remember, largely absentee kingship. So with Henry II and Richard, they don't spend that much time in England. So you've got a justiciar who is governing on their behalf. Um, People get used to quite an orderly system of justice. Um, when you then get the king periodically intervening and selling justice to the highest bidder, that strikes a bit of a strange note to people in terms of what they've got used to. What's happening with John, particularly after 1204, when Normandy has been lost, is that he's not absentee, he's in the country. So you feel the full force of the king's personality, and he needs lots of money. So he's doing all sorts of things like selling justice, like uh, behaving in ways that mean that people, his barons, his nobles in particular, don't feel that their landed property is secure, that their landed inheritance is secure. And they've got used to a situation where, for example, if they try to dispossess one of their tenants, that tenant can go back and say, well, you know what, I'll see you in court. Um, so your property has become a right under the common law. And yet, of course, the king isn't subject to his own law. So he then, when he kind of behaves differently in quite excessive ways, the sense of unfairness is amplified because you've got a sense of how it could be, how it should be, how you experience it with other people. And then all of a sudden, this doesn't apply to you. There's a double standard there. Um, and it's hard to understate quite how, sorry, it's hard to overstate quite how much of this John was doing in that period between 1204 and the kind of collapse of his alliances in 1214 that meant that he was just never going to get Normandy back. That was the backdrop to political crisis in England. Um, so yes, John's behaviour, yes, John's circumstances um, feed into this, but in this context where the world has changed, you don't just possess your property after the common law is created. You have a right to your property. It is protected by the king's law unless you're a baron and you're holding your land directly from the king. And so what people are saying is, okay, we want that to apply to our relationship with the king. So we want the king to be subject to exactly the same law as we're all subject to, so that we don't have this arbitrariness. So, the king wakes up one morning, he decides you're a villain. Oh, well, I'll threaten to dispossess that person, or I actually will dispossess that person. I'll disinherit them. Or the king needs lots of money. So, hey, again, I'll threaten or I actually will disinherit somebody. We want that to stop. That this we can't live our lives like this level of unpredictability day to day about what's going to happen to us individually. um and as I say, the education for that had come from the common law, had come from that stability and that absentee kingship that had created quite a different experience of the state from the one that people had, particularly between 1204 and 1214.
Yeah, I think it's just a very interesting time period in that regard, and he's certainly a very important and interesting figure. Kind of start off this period in time that we're looking at. I guess going on to his successor, Henry III, who was 9 when he takes over the crown. Considering he ended up ruling for about 56 years in the end, it's somewhat impressive that, given the kind of environment that we've talked about already, that he was able to hold on to England, given what he had inherited, given the forces from France, from Scotland, and what have you. I mean, what allows Henry to do so? I mean, I'm imagining he's massively helped by William uh, Marshall in this regard. He seems to actually be quite a good custodian figure from what I picked up from the book. Regents can kind of, I guess, can kind of go multiple ways and saying, but he seems to actually have been like a reasonable guy, individual, even sort of butting up against John in the previous the reign for a little bit for his own principles. But what allows Henry III to be able to hold on to England and then go on to become, well, I think some people would say it's a rather successful king within his time frame?
Let's go back to two fundamentals. One is the king was God's appointee, and that's a very powerful thing. So yes, you've got French forces on English soil. What people wanted at the point Henry came to the throne, what people wanted was a settlement in which it was accepted that the way that kingship had been happening, particularly under John, would not continue, that there would be some change in the way that kings would go about their business. They didn't want to get rid of the king per se. They wanted that settled. Now, it's complicated in a civil war because although that can be the fundamental, you then end up with all sorts of infighting that can mean that it snowballs and spirals completely out of control and ends up with something that nobody fundamentally wanted. So I don't think there was a sense in which anybody fundamentally wanted the French king to take over the English crown. I mean, an English throne. That's not that's not what was wanted, and ultimately, it was defeated. But the whole thing had snowballed, and John had proved immensely reluctant to accept any of the kind of compromises that Magna Carta was um, trying to impose on him. What happened in Henry III's minority was that William Marshall and the minority government as a whole realised that compromise had to happen. That they had, if they were going to keep this king on the throne, there would have to be some agreement about what the new parameters of kingship would look like. And as long as that was the case, most people were perfectly, willing and keen for the dynasty to be preserved. And when I say most people, certainly in the early 13th century, the people who are most engaged here are the barons. Um, the peasants in the localities, not so much. By the time you get to 1381, the peasants in the localities very much so, and we could talk about that later. But in this period, we're talking about most of the barons. Um, they want a settlement, and it's about how you deliver that settlement. Now, you've got people who within this don't want any sort of settlement because that's the sort of people they are. And those people get unleashed when you have political crisis. It's, they don't get kept in their box at that point. And so there becomes a kind of hangover in which you've also got to deal with those sort of, for want of a better word, stragglers. So you've got kind of two things going on there. The minority government, by and large, deals with that, and that sets things up for Henry III to be able to govern. Henry makes mistakes, and there are times when he crosses the line in terms of either the letter of Magna Carta or the spirit of Magna Carta. But what saves him repeatedly is the fact that when he's challenged, he backs down. And he does that in 1234, he does that in 1244, two kind of quite significant crises. He doesn't in 1258, but then that becomes another crisis in which a new set of principles an extension of the principles of Magna Carta are being fought for. And that's when he's in kind of most danger. Because again, it's a bit like the civil war that happened in John's reign. People are fighting for a principle at that point. This principle of the common good, and the king upholding it and not ruling arbitrarily, which had been by that point affecting the gentry as well as the nobility. So until 1258, because of the minority government, and then because Henry himself, he's not a great king, but he's not a disastrous king, and he doesn't push as hard as John. He backs off at critical moments. And because he's king, and most of the time, there isn't a sense that people are looking to get rid of a king. If it's not terrible, you don't want to get rid of him, because if you get rid of him, it'll be even worse potentially. And that that's the thing to always remember. So that kind of explains why he hangs on despite not being a brilliant ruler. You've got to be really, really bad for people to want to remove you. And we're talking tyrannical bad. We're talking Edward II tyranny. We're talking Richard II tyranny, and to some extent the tyranny that was associated with John.
Yeah, I guess you really have to be really, really bad, to your point, to really go against kind of God's will and God's chosen individual in that regard. And I think maybe this is a good point to kind of bring this up, actually. What I noticed, again, just when reading the book, there is certainly quite a large interplay between Christianity and the state in this period. You kind of see it to some degree throughout kind of most of the kings. And so I guess I'll sort of pass this on to you, Richard. Like, how would you describe the interactions and the influence of Christianity on the creation of the English state in this period?
So that's a really good question, Max, and I want to bring Caroline in due course. I think just a few reflections on that. Firstly, we need to define what we mean by Christianity. So there's Christian belief. There's the Christianity that is really important in people's everyday lives. There is Christianity that is described in the Bible, which is an almost constant reference point for people in their lives and in politics, actually. Classical references as well, of course, but the Bible is really, really important. There's the institution of the church nationally and internationally in the form of the papacy. The papacy acts as a kind of medieval United Nations. It's at the center of a lot of diplomatic activity, international negotiation. It also acts as a kind of international moral compass. But like the United Nations, it's contested. There are people who are on the wrong end of the papacy's attentions, like Robert Bruce in Scotland, for example, in the early 14th century, who would feel that the papacy was not actually seeing things very straight. And at a national level, in the creation of the state, what you see not just in England, but actually right across Europe, is the co-option of the structure of the church and of clergy, and particularly the co-option of their writing function to the state's purposes. So it's completely normal for all of the key, or many of the majority of the key civil servants to be bishops, abbots, other senior members of the clergy. If you're a junior civil servant, you are very likely to become a member of the clergy. You'll get your first religious benefice. It might be a big, relatively wealthy church that will underpin your career. And as you advance through the civil service, through government, you'll be raised in preferment in respect of the church as well. And that's done by the crown in negotiation with the papacy. Occasionally, there are divisions, there are differences between the king and the pope about who they wish to be promoted to a particular bishopric. And one of the things to remember here as well is that the bishops are, like all of the medieval nobility, European figures, international figures. They move right across the European stage. So there are key people within the English church who the Pope knows very well because they've worked in the papal court, or because they've worked as diplomats for the papacy, or because they've operated internationally as negotiators. And it's not always the case that that particular individual is the particular individual who the king wants to be promoted to be the next Archbishop of Canterbury or Bishop of Winchester, or whatever it might be. But in this respect, England is very much like any other European country. You see exactly the same sorts of things with France and with Scotland, I would say, as you see with England. But Caroline, you might want to add to some of that.
I think the key thing is to kind of think about the distinction between Christianity and how people interact with each other in those kind of accepted norms of behavior and expect the kind of expected moral universe, which is a different sort of Christianity from lots of what people would think of as Christianity today. It has much more capacity for violence in it than we have today, for example, I think. And the church and the papacy, because as Richard said, there's really distinct things there. I think one thing that, I mean, it wasn't within the scope of the book, but I think it's a really interesting thing to consider. When I was doing A level, I did the Tudors, and so we did the Reformation, the English Reformation, and obviously we kind of came across the school of thought that there was a kind of big kind of Protestant um, uh, groups of Protestant believers who grew in number, and they were really important. But actually, early on, it's a largely structural Reformation in which Henry VIII is making decisions about jurisdiction, and we see this in the medieval period that that a lot of the battles between the king and the pope are about jurisdiction, and that comes from one of the things that's a backdrop to the book that we were talking about. This sense of where secular and ecclesiastical authority, where the boundaries are between the two, the influence of Roman law on people's conceptions of their authority, particularly kings' conceptions of their authority that lead them to express their authority in particular ways, and then and they largely get that from the Pope. And so, of course, they're both sort of butting up against each other quite regularly in terms of the sorts of authority they're claiming. I can appoint bishops in my country. No, you can't. I'm the Pope. I can appoint them. Genuine dispute about that. So in lots of ways, what happened with Henry VIII was a kind of product of a very long-term discussion between, and I say discussion as a diplomatic way of putting it, between rulers not just in England but elsewhere too, in the papacy, about whose jurisdiction was where and where each of the jurisdictions should terminate. Alongside, I mean, other things as well. But it if you think about it in that way, you understand a lot more about where the Reformation came from. It wasn't just something Henry VIII dreamt up, from nowhere. And so there's this really complex relationship between the papacy as the kind of UN of its time, and the papacy actually as a sort of rival in terms of jurisdictional authority to kings. So you've got a kind of multi-layered and often very difficult relationship there.
Yeah, I suppose in some regards, the right to rule through God can, in one hand, be a very beneficial thing, and so in ensuring stability and things like that, and even trying to not to pose kings because of that right. But then in other regards, when you have things like the papacy that kind of can exert influence over the countries where it kind of brings up its own kind of problems, I guess, to some degree. And I guess the kings in this period kind of deal with that a little bit differently. For example, I think John, for example, wrestled with the Pope over the Bishop of Canterbury appointment. That leads to some tension and some consequences. Henry III, for example, gets the support of the Pope, and I think my understanding is that helps him keep power to some degree. As we move on to here, Edward I. Edward is very much seen, well, it is at least described by the historian Mark Morris as a great and terrible king in terms of the title of his book. How much truth do you think that holds? And how does his impact on the creation of England compare to the other kings that we look at in this time frame?
I think, I mean, terrible is a kind of and great. Similarly, they're about how historians, how people at the time conceive of a ruler. I think in Edward I's case, I'd frame it slightly differently. I think at one level, he really gets it in terms of he understands that, and this is a fundamental we haven't really talked about yet. If we go back to what we were saying about John and the way he took money for war from his subjects arbitrarily, and that was the problem, that it was arbitrary. What Magna Carta establishes, because of its acceptance and because of the compromises made early in Henry III's reign, and because Henry III himself says, look, I accept these principles, that the king, if he wants to fight war, which of course they often have to, will have to find new ways of funding it. And given that you can only borrow money for so long, that's always a stopgap, and that there are no other sources of funding that are going to give you the sort of money that you need than your own subjects. What that means in practice is you're going to have to reach an accommodation with them in which you agree parameters within which they will give you money. Okay, and that's what Parliament does. So when Parliament is created, it's a forum for essentially asking for that money and for the discussion to take place about the justification for the war and whether the king is likely to prevail in that war, etc. Henry never fully gets his head round the idea that means that his greatest subjects, at least, and as the reign goes on, because of the fact that he's trying to get money out of a wider range of his subjects, the gentry as well, will want to have a say in foreign policy. He just doesn't get his head around that. Edward does. He recognizes that, yes, the calls are going to be his, but this is always going to have to be discussed now, because you're only going to be able to get money from your subjects by consent. So yeah, if we want to use the descriptor great, in that sense, yes, it's a great intellectual achievement to get your head around that and to say, okay, I realize that the world in which I'm governing is a different world from the one that John was governing in. Terrible. Yes, he did some pretty awful things, and there are a number of things that we could point to that are pretty dreadful. Edward and his wife and the expulsion of the Jewish community from England. There is nothing good you can say about that. Obviously, it's absolutely terrible. It doesn't matter that in the Middle Ages people conceived of these things differently. It's still heinous. So there are things he did that, both by the standards of his time and not by the standards of his time, were pretty terrible. It's just no way of getting around that. And I think one of the things that happens is, if we go back to politics, is although he understands the dynamics of getting taxation, there is a point at which he says, but beyond this line, these are all my calls. So, for example, his subjects increasingly want to decide when they think a war is necessary, because a war being necessary triggers, all things being equal, that they should just give the king money to fight it. So they want to get into a discussion about whether they think it's necessary. Edward's attitude is, I decide on that. You don't decide on that. I decide on whether this is for the common good. You don't decide on that. That is not a matter for discussion between us. But for his subjects, it is. And we hear a lot of talk about red lines in politics these days. So why don't we use the same phrase? Edward had his red lines, and beyond that, there's a blind spot. And that means that in order to get his way, he will be duplicitous. And he was duplicitous. So you've got a complex array of things. He was fantastic in terms of seeing his way through complicated political situation, in terms of the things he did to try to deal with crime, his approach to using legislation to make large scale reforms to the legal system. These are all really remarkable things. So that thinking on a kind of grand um, uh, canvas, if you like, is amazing. But like everybody, he's not straightforward.
And I guess whether you see him as either great or terrible or a mix of both, um, I think you make it, I think, fairly clear in the book that Edward II, I think if you call him feckless, lack of application and poor political judgment. I think is a quote that I can take from the book. And I've noticed this a couple of times in this period specifically, but honestly, it happens a little bit when I look at the Roman Empire as well and some other periods, is that you do tend to get a little bit of a trend of bad rulers kind of following good rulers, depending on how you sort of categorize those terms. You can maybe see it in regards to how Richard followed Edward in some regard. You can certainly see it in some of the Roman emperors. And you can certainly see it in terms of how Henry sort of followed John. Why is there this kind of manifestation of this kind of trend for bad rulers to follow good rulers? Or is that like an over the simplification of quite a complex historical environment?
I think, I mean, at the risk of sounding slightly reductive, Max, there's a 50% chance you're going to get a bad one after a good one, and a 50% chance you're going to get another good one or a reasonable one. Actually, it's not 50-50, isn't it? Because you've got really capable people, really incapable and irresponsible people, and people in between. And I think some of how the people in between are seen is by contrast with the person who came before. And I think Henry III is a good example of that because he came after King John. He obviously seems like a pretty benign character. And in many ways, he was quite a benign character. But as Caroline said earlier, he wasn't actually a very effective king. What he wasn't was the sort of absolutely dig your heels in, cruel tyrant that John was. Um, in Henry IV and Henry V, you've got two decent, effective kings in succession. In Henry II and Richard the Lionheart, you've got two decent and effective kings in succession. Now, these were not perfect people. Henry V, very complex character. Henry IV, compromised in various ways. Henry II and Richard Lionheart, as Caroline said earlier, part of this great dysfunctional family. But if you're looking at functional kingship, these people were, you had two pretty decent ones, one after another. So I think it's the sort of thing that you notice, but I think it's probably a bit more apparent than real. But there may be something in the contrast with what went before. I mean, it's something that I often say about Edward III when I'm teaching Edward III, which is that even if Edward III hadn't been a kind of extraordinarily talented person, his talent visible even at the age of 16 and 17, and that talent including terrifying people as well as being super capable, even had he not been that person, after Edward II and then the tyranny of Isabella and Mortimer, he'd have had such a honeymoon period, even if he'd been a mediocrity. So I think the contrast speaks to this quite a bit, actually.
Yeah, certainly. And I guess that kind of brings us on to Edward III. Could you just give me a little bit of details in regards to the kind of challenges and big components of his reign that really sticks out? And then I guess how that really does relate back into the kind of the topic question of the book in terms of the English and the making of the English state.
Yes, that's an excellent question. So when he came to the throne in 1327, of course, he was very much in the leading strings of his mother, Queen Isabella, and her political partner and probable lover, Roger Mortimer, Earl of March, who was a very capable and ruthless individual. And of course, Edward was only 14, so it took him time to um, uh, find his political feet, but he found them really extremely quickly. And by the time he was 16, Mortimer was properly scared of him. And of course, he removed Mortimer forcibly in the great coup d'etat at Nottingham Castle in October 1330, when he was still only 17 years old. An extraordinary individual. He knew what he had to deal with. He had to deal with 20 years of really ineffective government under Edward II that had become tyranny, in which there'd been a huge land grab by Edward and by his favourites, the Despensers, Edward II and the Despensers, in which the legal system had been turned on its head, in which there'd been a series of terrible foreign policy disasters. He had to deal with the consequences of that, amplified by the even worse consequences of the 3 years of tyranny of Isabella and Mortimer. So there was an awful lot to fix, both internally and externally. And his great exemplar was his grandfather, Edward I, who he lionised. Edward I was, as Caroline said, a great innovator, institutional innovator, very intelligent man in many respects. But Edward III took a lot of Edward I's initiatives and pursued them to their logical conclusion. And he did it with political finesse and wisdom and drive that actually meant that probably in the end the system delivered far more than even Edward I had imagined. And I think you see that innovation, the continuation and innovation, both in the law and in military reform. We have what we now call the Edwardian military revolution, in which the English became the preeminent fighting force in Europe, essentially undefeatable on the field of battle. And of course, that had huge positive ramifications for English foreign policy. But Edward III also presided over the continuation of the growth of the common law and the rationalization of the common law and of governmental systems to make government much more effective for ordinary people. So, like his grandfather, he was a great reformer, but he perhaps had this additional dimension of flexibility that at certain points Edward I lacked. And you see this with Edward III. You see him, he's such an extraordinary character, even in the governmental records. You see him intervening and speaking all the time. It's a commonplace of history to say that we can't really know what medieval monarchs were like, but actually, where they were heavily involved in government, you really can see that because they spoke all the time in the records and through the records. And Edward III was somebody who would regularly say, I have been thinking about this really hard and I have changed my mind. The thing that I was planning to do that you objected to, I now agree was not the right thing to do. But equally, he was somebody who would frequently say, I know you all object, but I am doing it. This is the right thing to do, and it is my right to do it. So he was this combination of flexible and really, really strong. And it's only really in the 1370s, when he was starting to be quite elderly and ill, that he starts to lose his grip on politics. And England ceases to be so effective, particularly in foreign policy terms. Being effective in foreign policy terms is really all about your internal political strength, in my view. And there starts to be quite a big generation gap between Edward III as king and the political community, the nobles. And one of the great things that Edward III did right at the start of his reign was to create a service nobility, remold the nobility as people who were servants of government, servants of the realm. But he was able to do that. This is one of the ways in which he was lucky, partly because everything had been so torn apart under Edward II and Isabella and Mortimer that he simply had more scope to remodel things. Had things not been torn apart by Edward II and Isabella and Mortimer, Edward III probably wouldn't have been able to do so much reorienting of government to make it more effective. Maybe that also speaks to your earlier question, Max, about the good king and the bad king. That maybe the kings who came after a period of terrible turmoil did have more scope for making improvements.
Oh, I
But
see. So
he's
it's kind of
very,
relativistic in some regards. If you've come after a very good king, it's kind of like a fine margins on how you then subsequently improve those characters. However, if you come after quite a bad king, there are typically, I would imagine, quite obvious fixes to certain problems. So maybe
yeah.
you can at least be seen as being correcting certain things, and also maybe just get off to a good run at the start. To I think some things that Caroline mentioned earlier. particularly at the start of reigns, particularly when kings are either quite young or they're quite new. There's this kind of period where it kind of up in the air and it can be a lot of chaos and disorientation. And I suppose being able to hit the ground running with some maybe easy fixes in some regard can help you lay the foundation to be able to succeed into a long reign. I think something that we've talked about quite a bit here is that being able to provide stability and predictability in a reign is one of the key
Yeah.
factors in being successful as an English monarch in this time period.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. But I think one of the things that shows us that Edward III is so remarkable is that actually there isn't much low hanging fruit at the start. The inheritance is really, really tough. And yet he manages to make headway quickly, particularly with the nobility and the remodeling, the refocusing of government. But then remember that the 1330s are a really tough decade. And one of the things about Edward III is that he keeps going when things are going wrong. He keeps coming back. But he also, again, I think, is lucky with foreign policy when his foreign policy really turns out to be misplaced in 1314. It's not that he does the wrong things, it's just that the usual things, the things that Edward I had done, aren't going to work. Too expensive, too diffuse. And when his foreign policy fails, his Grand Alliance policy fails in 1340, he's forced really to take a much more radical approach, which is when the Edwardian military revolution really gets kind of supercharged. And then he comes back in the 1340s with these amazing, very compact, highly professional armies that just blow everybody off the battlefield. But again, it's that combination of luck and the ability to take the opportunity.
And I guess obviously we're to round out our group of six kings in this period. We kind of move on to Richard. Uh, Richard is a figure that I think I first kind of got into learning more about actually from reading Dan Jones's book on Henry V. And despite some of the weaknesses, obviously, in Richard's reign, revolts and trying to secure parts of the kingdom, he does actually, ironically, seem to be quite a poignant figure, actually, for a young Henry V, who probably goes on to probably, in my estimation, probably one of the best kings of like the English monarchy. So, talk to me a little bit about Richard II and how effective his reign was, what led to his downfall and essentially his throne being seized. But then maybe some of the elements that maybe we don't quite understand in regards to what some nuances, but also some elements that maybe go underappreciated during his time period.
The thing about Richard is that he just didn't really understand what the king was supposed to do. The king had, as Caroline said earlier, immense authority, absolutely unrivaled authority. And that authority meant that everybody else's power, the power that lay in the hands of nobles through their great lands and their great wealth, their physical might, was borrowable for the king's purposes because of the king's authority. If the king was governing in the common good, if he was governing in the interests of the realm and the people, and it was clear that he was, there was almost no limit to what he could do. Richard simply did not understand that. What Richard saw in the nobles was rivals and threats that simply did not exist in reality. And that's, I think, embedded in his narcissistic and paranoid and rather kind of petty and vengeful personality, but may also be connected with a childhood when he was a very young king, when there was a great deal of political turmoil because of a vacuum of leadership really since the mid 1370s. And when the Peasants' Revolt had had a really chastening effect on government and had made the financial side of government really difficult. So Richard came to political adulthood in a time of great turmoil. But unlike Edward III, who stopped the turmoil, Richard II continued the turmoil and in many ways exaggerated the turmoil. And it's exactly what we were saying earlier. It's the kind of antithesis of the effective king. So rather than predictable, he was unpredictable. Rather than governing for the common good, He was governing for himself and a narrow coterie of favourites, and favourites who were not regarded by the rest of the political community as worthy people, not because they lacked status, but because they lacked ability and focus and they failed to deliver. It's one of the things that I think we often are mistaken about in the Middle Ages, that it was all about status and hierarchy. Well, those things were important. But these are also times in which it was possible for somebody from a relatively lowly background to become a member of the nobility in their own lifetime through public service, through really excellent public service. And the people whom Richard surrounded himself with were not those people. They were people who were regarded largely as problematic and troublesome and unworthy and who didn't deliver. Now, Richard was checked relatively early in his reign in a political crisis in 1386 that was produced by him asking for um, uh, four subsidies, four levies of taxation in one go, only 6 months after he'd had a huge subsidy. And all of this money was supposed to deal with a French invasion threat that was very real and scary, and the money just slipped through Richard's fingers. And Parliament in 1386 effectively hit the roof and said, "Where on earth has all of this money gone? You cannot ask for this money at this degree. There has to be a plan." And Richard just refused to engage. And then he was almost opposed, but not quite. He was still young, and I think his youth protected him. And instead of seeing the error of his ways because of his limited political intelligence, he then saw the need to fight back, to seek vengeance, to have more power. And the rest of his reign really was about competing with his nobles for control, but also behaving in unpredictable ways that made the political community feel extremely unsettled. One doesn't want to draw comparisons that are too reductive and trite. But if you think about the unpredictability of Donald Trump, imagine that, but with even more absolute power attached to it, where you've just got absolutely no idea what is going to happen next. And that's never going to be sustainable rule. And I think actually, I think Dan Jones's book on Henry V, which is an excellent book, does talk very interestingly about Henry V's experience in Richard II's court and ways, particularly around their sense of majesty, in which they were perhaps quite alike. But the book that absolutely gets to the heart of Richard II, I think, in detail, is Helen Castor's most recent book, The Eagle and the Heart, which compares Richard II and Henry Bolingbroke, Henry IV, and really does, I think, expose Richard's limitations brilliantly. Though Helen doesn't quite say in the book what she will say to you face to face, which is the fundamental problem with Richard was that he just wasn't very bright. He didn't get it. He didn't understand. He didn't know what he needed to do to make things work, and he didn't want to do them, even if he'd know.
No, that's interesting. I think I'll have to try and pick up the book and perhaps even get her on at some point. Uh, Obviously, that brings us again to, I guess, the end of the Six Kings, I guess, in this period. And I think when I was going over the book, one thing that kind of maybe struck me because of, to some degree, the title, but I guess some level of ignorance from going into it, um, is that despite obviously the book being about the making of the English state, so often I see in the book is the King of England essentially not really considering himself that English and also spending a lot of time either in France or trying to reclaim lands or expand territories in France. And so I just think it almost I guess I just bring you in on this, Caroline, just to kind of ask you, despite this creation of England as a state and its development, uh, do these English kings actually consider themselves to be English? And if so, at what point do you start to see that transition from a more Angevin, Plantagenet, or to some degree French identity into a more English identity?
It's a really good question. I think I think I would slightly reframe it in the sense that it doesn't matter kind of when you're talking about in the period. This is an immensely interconnected set of kings across Europe, and particularly between the English and the French and and Spain, divided as Spain was into separate kingdoms. Um, so you would often be, marry. you might be the King of England and married to the sister of the King of France or married to the daughter of the King of France, as happened very regularly. Certainly, you see yourself as king of a territorial um, domain, so to speak. Um, that's undoubtedly the case. But throughout this period, the English kings have a foot in France. They remain with a foot in France for most of the period. And that foot in France is part of their historic identity. So if you asked me now, for example, do I feel English? There is a concept of Englishness. I was born in England. I have that identity, but I'm also from a long heritage on both sides of from Ireland. Um, so, and do I feel that? Is that my cultural heritage as well? Is that part of my identity? Yes, it is. Um, and I don't even now have any landed interest in Ireland. I don't have any relatives that I know of living there. If you take the English kings in this period, they retain for the most part that landed interest. So that identity is always not just about one country. That said, is there a sense that there is an English crown, that they are defending the belongings of the things that pertain to that crown? Yes, there is. Does that mean something in this period? One thing I think we would say through the book is it comes to mean more through the period. So if you're talking about John, there is, as you said, very much that kind of Angevin conception of things. By the time you get, I think, to Edward III, and even to some extent Edward I, it's the English crown they're talking about and thinking of themselves in that way. So I suppose the answer to your question is yes and no. Certainly from my perspective. I'd be interested in what Richard thinks of this one, because it's a fantastic question.
Robin Frame says something in his great book on the development of the British Isles. He says that the aristocracy were Europeans, that they strode across Europe with aplomb. And that's right. So it's not just the kings who were European, and they were European. It's also the political community, which is European. These were people who were well traveled, who were internationally connected, who didn't see nationality in narrow terms. Now, nationalism is increasing at this time. And there's a brilliant book on this by Andrea Ruddick. Um, and that national identity is coming into focus, I think, more sharply because of geopolitical conflict in France, in Scotland, in Wales, Ireland, in Spain, in the Low Countries, um, even more widely than that. Um, so that international friction is starting to bring national identity more strongly into focus. But fundamentally, these people are multilingual, extremely well traveled. They're operating within the same Christian and cultural framework as everybody else who they're coming across. They are European figures. When the Earl of Arundel and Henry of Grosmont, the first Duke of Lancaster, are on diplomatic mission to the papacy at Avignon, I think in the mid 1350s, they're so famous across Europe that some contemporaries estimate that 150,000 people came out just to see them as they came across the bridge, the famous bridge, the Pont d'Avignon. They struggled to get across the bridge. So international celebrity is not a new thing.
No, certainly. I think it's it's a really interesting concept in terms of identity. And I think that to your point, from what I understand, as time went on, I do think you start to get a little bit more of this sense of Englishness, eventually, I think some people kind of forget in this regard the language of the court in England for a long period of time from William the Conqueror onward was French. And, it doesn't, the language of English, which I think a lot of people would do associate with identity. Language is a very intrinsic part of identity, doesn't come into it like a lot later. But I guess to your point in regards to the making of the English state in this period, you do see at least like the shoots of that kind of identity taking hold a lot more. I was curious to some degree though, obviously this is a very specific time period. It's kind of these 200 years, like exactly, as it turns out. There's got the start of the Plantagenet era. But I was curious if there was like a seventh king or even queen, maybe, that you had to add the book, and it doesn't necessarily have to be in the exact time frames that we're looking at, that kind of helps build upon the themes and the messages of the book in regards to this kind of creation of an English identity. Who comes to mind? I mean, from my perspective, I guess, to kind of dovetail on this, I think William the Conqueror to some degree, because I think that provides a lot of the context surrounding why the English kings are kind of so intrinsically, in terms of identity, linked to France, obsessed with France in many ways. And to some of the temperaments, I think, that come from him. He's obviously the kind of founder of that dynasty in many ways. And then you've got kind of what Henry V that kind of comes after that. This little bit period who I think kind of expands the English territories to a point that, kind of, at least within France, is like their kind of maximum point. And I think up to a very short period, almost becomes the king of France. If he dies just a little bit later on, he might have even become the king of France. We might be looking at a very different England today. So yeah, I'd just be very interested to get your thoughts on like who is this magical seventh figure that you would, if you had to add to the book, that would kind of maybe build upon the themes and the kind of messagings that you identified.
I'm going to cheat, Max. It's eight.
Oh,
I think it's got to be Henry II and Richard the Lionheart. So we add two at the start. And why? Because Henry II, in many ways, represented a reset, a fresh beginning after the anarchy, and particularly because of the common law and because of the Angevin inheritance. This is the point where we started. This really sets the agenda. Everything really comes out of those two. So I think you've got to start with Henry II. And if you start with Henry II, it's crazy not to then stick Richard the Lionheart in as well. So you end up with eight rather than six.
and how about you, Carolyn? What's your kind of perspective? Are you similar along similar lines, or?
I would say exactly the same. And one of the things, I mean, I know, people looking at the book are kind of like, in some cases, why did you start in 1199? If we're talking about the creation of the English state, it goes a lot further back, you know, and all of that's true. And we were just trying to sort of pick a point where we thought that there were really fundamental developments. I think had we had the capacity to add Henry II and Richard I, we absolutely would have done. I think they would have been the ones that would be kind of most crucial. Out of interest, Henry IV to me, because I just think he's so fascinating. But I think um, Helen Castor has absolutely nailed that one. I feel like having read Helen Castor's book, I understand Henry IV in a way that I never did before. And it's quite rare that a history book completely transforms your understanding of somebody. So it just sort of gives a sense of what a great book that is. So we can't have Henry IV, but yeah, Henry II and Richard I.
But going back to why 1199, because really that's the immediate background to Magna Carta. And Magna Carta is the kind of lens that brings everything into focus in terms of the Constitution, and from which everything else then is the light that sprays out. It made no sense to start partway through a Ray. But in a way, I mean, when we were conceptualizing this, Caroline, we were really thinking about Magna Carta, weren't we?
No, and I think that makes a lot of sense in terms of like its influence certainly throughout the course of English and international history. I guess actually just as we sort of come to the end of the conversation, um, with the mention of Magna Carta there, like I'm wondering for the viewers at home that obviously maybe is not as informed about history and some of the nuances of the period that we're talking about. What are some of the modern political and institutional lessons that you think that readers can take from this early period of Plantagenet state building that can be applied to the modern day, or even like our sense of Englishness as an identity and how we look at moving forward, I guess, as a country and a dominion?
I suppose the thing I would most focus on is the common good and what the common good means. It's a very easy term to use. It's a very difficult term both to define and to kind of live up to in the policies that you um, enact. So I think the big message of this period is that you have to talk to people, you have to consult people, you have to understand the pressure points for those people. On a day to day level, what matters to them. So I talked about one of the things that was really great about Edward the First was um, his dealing with crime. Now, a big part of that was that he saw that if crime was out of control, it damaged his authority. It damaged royal authority. It damaged government. And that's absolutely right. Um, but I think there was, not, I don't just think, I know there was also this sense that his job was to protect his people from what he would term oppressions, whether they were by his own officials, whether they were by criminals. And if he couldn't do that as king, he'd failed. And these are things that matter to people. It mattered to people, and and it matters to people now that you don't come home and find that your house has been burgled, that you can walk down the street safely, um, and the fundamentals of kind of stripping back what it means for people's well-being to be looked after. And of course, government does so much more now. It has so much more of an economic role. We have a healthcare system. So there are many more facets to the common good now than there were in the medieval period, but the principle holds. And so there's a reason why governments repeatedly use the mantra of the common good in political dialogue.
Except they don't, do they? What they actually talk about is ordinary working people. So we're bedeviled by this kind of dialogue around imagined elites, the other, the enemy, and we have government that all the time is chasing, and even more now with more fragmented politics in the UK, chasing a relative handful of votes in order to remain in. And that means that government has not been, for a very long time, focused upon the common good, not on getting re-elected, but on doing the right thing for the country. And I think that's one of the lessons that I would hope that politicians would be able to take from the past, is that actually successful government is about making difficult decisions and prioritizing the things that really need to be prioritized. I think of Robert Peel, who in many ways did things that perhaps didn't come naturally to him. I think of him saying, we must make this country a cheap country for living. This was before widespread democracy. This was not because he was chasing votes. It's because he understood that the way that he could help the largest number of people during the Industrial Revolution was to make their lives affordable. And that seems to me to be a very, very different thing from targeting particular groups and throwing them baubles, or protecting their interests when actually we need to be thinking writ large. I mean, I think of the state of the Royal Navy and the Air Force, and I think it's shameful. And that's something that we can lay at the door of successive governments who simply weren't willing to make difficult enough decisions.
Certainly, and I think that concept, I think, is something that the public can take away, but also potentially our politicians as well, by the sounds of it as well. Caroline, Richard, this has been really, really great. I really just appreciate you taking the time out. And obviously, Arise England, Six Kings and the Making of the English State is available at all good book outlets. So again, I just want to take the time to thank you guys for coming on.
Thanks so much for
Thank
having
you,
us,
Max.
Max. We've really appreciated coming on. It's been a really interesting discussion. Thank you.